Woman merely shook the dust from her rag, but the man mistook it for a wave. So he took off his hat and responded with excitement. His hearty laugh made the woman's heart skip a beat. She didn't feel like poking her head out until the man was gone. But being a maid in a rich man's house was a nightmare for love. But the next day she shook the rag again. And this time, the man still responded with the same enthusiasm. This warmed Anne's heart. On the third day, it was raining heavily and she thought the man wouldn't pass by. But then the man appeared. But there was no sign of him at the window. He left in despair. On the fourth day, Annie stood at the window for a long time, but she didn't see the smile. She thought she'd never see him again. But on the fifth day, the doorbell rang. Annie answered the door as she always did. It was the same man who knocked on the door. The man's name was Mark. Annie wanted to explain that it was a coincidence, but she hesitated. Then Mark invited Annie to a film tonight, but Annie had work to do and couldn't get off until 7. So they arranged to meet in front of the cinema at 8 o'clock. It was the first time she'd ever received flowers, and she was so happy. Soon they arrived at the venue. Mark took the initiative and bought 2 tickets, acting like a gentleman. But as the film began, he slowly put his hand on Annie's shoulder. I guess a lot of people's love begins with a film. Soon it was the 6th day. Annie asked Mark to go somewhere with her. She even fixed his tie for him, so she was taking him to meet her parents. And Mark wasn't shy, and so the day passed without a hitch. But what he didn't realize was that when Annie asked to go to Mark's house, she was refused. He refused because he was too poor, and the streets were dirty. Annie didn't take it personally and made a bold decision. The next day she resigned. She was going to marry Mark. The noblewoman had a disdain for love, but when she saw Anne and Mark in love, the word jealousy was written all over her face. Then they went to a new neighborhood. The house they had bought in installments over 30 years was their wedding home. But after seeing it, they realized it was worth it. The house is very spacious with huge floor-to-ceiling windows. In the bathroom, there was a bathtub and a toilet with a manual flush. But in Annie's mind, she had already planned a children's room, and there was a garden at the back of the house. The two of them hugged happily and looked forward to a better life. By the 8th day, they were ready to get married. For the rest of the day, Mark worked hard outside and kept the house in good order. They lived a quiet and sweet life. But one day, Annie suddenly broke down and cried. Mark rushed over to comfort her. It turned out that they hadn't been able to have a child in the 2 years they'd been married. Annie was already 37 years old. She was afraid that she would never be able to get pregnant again, so she was in great pain. So Mark bought the big mirror that his wife wanted to surprise her. But what he didn't expect was, Annie had a surprise for Mark too. It turned out that Annie was pregnant. Mark jumped up and down with joy at the sudden news. They hugged each other tightly. Soon it was Annie's birthday. Mark prepared a card and flowers for her. By this time, Annie was pregnant. A few months later, the baby was born. The two of them were discussing what to name the new baby, but the doctor interrupted them and asked Mark to step outside. The doctor said Mark's wife was 37 years old. It would be better not to have any more children. Annie would be in danger of having a baby at an advanced age. It took a moment for Mark to realize he was lucky to have a wife. After that, his husband would take care of the children. Annie washed the nappies and put them in the washing machine. And so, 3 years later, the baby had grown into a little boy. He was so cute with his naturally curly blonde hair. Next to them was a new coffee shop. Looking at the high-class decor, the prices must have been high. Mark promised to take her there next time, so the family went home happily. But what Mark didn't expect was to find Annie crying on the sofa. It turned out that their child was about to go to school. However, the school was required to shave the boy's head flat. The rest of the family was very happy. In their spare time, they would often take their children to the beach for holidays. The family thought they would be happy forever. But on this day, Mark stood in front of the radio with a heavy face. The atmosphere of the whole city seemed to be particularly heavy. It turned out that the invaders had begun to build up troops around them and perhaps a war was about to break out. To be on the safe side, Mark boarded up the windows of his house and filled the gaps with glue. Then the family put on gas masks. It was the only way they could feel safe. But it wasn't long before the air raid sirens started blaring and the war began. The family hugged each other nervously. But that day, the government announced it would evacuate millions of children from the city, even though Anne was reluctant to leave. But for safety reasons, they finally put the children on the train. And Annie, as a mother, was forced to part with her 5-year-old. How much pain must have been in her heart. Back home, Mark built a shelter in the backyard. The next day, Mark was assigned to the fire service. He was in the middle of a smoky, dangerous city, and Annie joined the backup team. Every day was scary for them. The only consolation was a letter from their son. But the turmoil has left the family in shambles. Even the fence in front of the house is being taken down and turned into shells. To make Annie feel better, Mark said he'd build a wooden fence tomorrow. But the war was brutal. One dark night, their house was not spared. So they thought they'd take the time to fix up the house and see the boy they hadn't seen in a long time. The boy had already adjusted to life in the country. When they met, the family smiled for the first time. They also dreamed of having a cottage here. But the house in the city still had a mortgage of over 20 years. When he came back to the city, Mark immediately built a metal cage. When he got inside, it was just the right size. It turned out to be a new bed for them to sleep in at night. But then the air raid sirens went off. Mark blew out the candles, and despite his own fears, he held his wife tightly in his arms. Luckily, The cage was strong enough to keep them safe. It's almost Christmas Day. People were finally reunited with their children. There was singing and dancing and smiles on everyone's faces. But one of Mark's colleagues couldn't be happier. The night before, a bomb had silently taken his son. Mark apologized. I don't know how long it took, but as the sun rose, the war was over. The family resumed their quiet life. But that day, a police car pulled up in front of the house. The boy had been caught stealing. Luckily, the police only gave him a verbal warning. Annie couldn't believe her son was stealing. She gave him a hard time, though their lives were seldom easy along the way. But in the 10 years since the war, the bond between them has not diminished. In his spare time, Mark would always take Annie to enjoy their time together. But late at night, they worried about the future of their children. The boy had gone to university. He had long hair and there was even a girl waiting for him at the door. The two of them watched, but in their hearts, they thought they'd meet the girl's parents if they had the chance. But then a letter came along that threw all their plans out of whack. The boy was about to be drafted into the Royal Regiment. They were sad to see him go, but they were proud. So for the rest of their lives, they went to the newly installed telephone and waited for their son to call. They waited for 3 years. The years had turned them gray at the temples, and Mark always had a surprise for Annie. He'd secretly bought a car, so they went for a drive in the countryside. And to top it all off, they got a letter from their son. It said he was coming home from the army, but they couldn't have guessed that there was a girl with him. Though she was slim, Annie didn't seem to like it. But Annie's desire to have a grandchild overcame that dissatisfaction. So one day Annie asked her son what they were going to do about having children. But the son said they couldn't have children because her wife was schizophrenic. But bad luck didn't stop there. One day they were watching TV. But then, out of the blue, Annie asked her husband who he was. Annie was sick. Mark took her to the hospital for treatment. It turned out to be Alzheimer's. As Annie talked to her son, she couldn't remember what day Christmas was. Looking at Annie's condition, Mark turned away and left the hospital room, wiping away her tears. In order to refresh Annie's memory, Mark took her to the place where they first met. The cafe was in a state of disrepair until now, and had never been able to sit in it. Mark wanted to take his wife out more often, but that night, the hospital called out of the blue. When the call was over, it was as if Mark had used all his strength to put the phone down. His wife, who had been with him all his life, was gone. Father and son were in pain. In the days that followed, Mark was alone in the big room. He always had 2 sets of cutlery for dinner, perhaps in his mind, and had never really left. And the one left behind was the one who suffered the most when one of them left first. That day, Mark was reading the newspaper when he felt a sharp pain in his body. But there was only one black cat in the house to look at him. It wasn't long before Mark followed Annie, and they ended their lives happily ever after. Annie was actually 5 years older than Mark, but Mark always treated her like a child. He always had surprises in store for her. When Annie was sad, Mark would give her a hug, and Annie took good care of the family. She never minded Mark's low income. They were together all their lives. They've been through a lot of hard times and hardships with each other. That's the best thing about marriage. Whether you're poor or rich, whether you're old or sick or dead, I'll always love you.